Welcome to the to meeting number 25 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Environment and Sustainable Development. Pursuant to the order of reference of Wednesday, March 24th, 2021, the committee is commencing consideration of Bill C-230, an act respecting the development of a national strategy to redress environmental racism. To ensure an orderly meeting, I would like to outline a few rules. Members and witnesses may speak in either official language, because interpretation, among other things, interpretation services are available for this meeting. Of course, Dr. Waldron, I guess you've seen that you can choose, to listen to the floor version, the English version, or the French version. For members and witnesses, please wait till you're recognized before clicking on your microphone icon to unmute yourself. The rest, I think, is pretty much common sense. Each witness, Ms. Zan and Dr. Waldron, will have 5 minutes of opening comments, and then we'll go to a round of questions. Well, actually, two rounds of questions, because we this first hour is dedicated to our two witnesses, and then we'll have some departmental officials for the second hour. Yeah, so we'll start now. I don't know if Ms. Zan, congratulations on getting your bill to through second reading to the committee, and the floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. And I do want to thank the committee. Thank you, everybody, for being here. And thank you for your comments in the House for first and second reading. Very interesting comments. I'd also like to thank Dr. Waldron for being here today, because she really has been the inspiration for me for presenting this bill. Bill C-230, a national strategy to redress environmental racism. Colleagues, like systemic racism, environmental racism is something that sadly has been part of the fabric of Canada for too many years. Environmental racism refers to the fact that communities of color are disproportionately burdened with health hazards due to policies and practices that have been forced upon them to live in proximity to sources of toxic waste, such as dumps, toxic waste sites, sewage works, mines, landfills, power stations, chemical plants, major roads, and emitters of airborne particulate matter. As a result, these communities suffer greatly, and they suffer greater rates of health problems attendant on hazardous pollutants. Although the term environmental racism seems new to some, it was actually coined in 1982 by African-American civil rights leader Benjamin Chavez, who described it as, and I quote, "racial discrimination in environmental policymaking, the enforcement of regulations and laws, the deliberate targeting of communities of color for toxic waste facilities, the official sanctioning of the life-threatening presence of poisons and pollutants in our communities, and the history of excluding people of color from leadership of the ecology movements." Public awareness has grown about this issue in the last number of years, and there's no doubt in my mind that the time has come for government to act, both to acknowledge and address the issue. Surely we owe this to all Canadians. I'm sure that as lawmakers, we all can agree that it is a human right for all Canadians to have clean air and water in their communities, and I know our government is working very hard to make sure that that happens. I did become aware of this issue only about 7 years ago when I first met Dr. Ingrid Waldron, when she explained what her research and data collecting was proving about the existence of environmental racism in Nova Scotia. And if anyone still questions the reality of environmental racism, I really recommend Dr. Waldron's book, There's Something in the Water, or watch the Netflix documentary based on the book. The short summary of the bill requires that the Minister of Environment, in consultation with representatives of provincial and municipal governments, of Indigenous communities and other affected communities, to develop a national strategy to promote efforts across Canada to redress the harm caused by environmental racism. It also provides for reporting requirements in relation to the strategy, and it would collect data including socioeconomic circumstances, physical and mental effects of communities across Canada that are affected by environmental racism. We know that these effects are wide-ranging, from skin rashes and upset stomachs to more serious ailments like respiratory illness, cardiovascular disease, reproductive morbidity, including preterm births, and babies born with Down syndrome, as well as various cancers that disproportionately affect women. There's evidence that many chronic diseases in Indigenous communities, for instance, are not primarily due to genetics or internal factors, but actually to external factors, what's in the air, in the water, in our environment. I'm grateful to members who have already supported my bill thus far, including the member from Saanich Gulf Islands who seconded Bill C-230. And I would suggest that this is an example of what Canadians truly want to see in their government, especially in these dangerous times. Parliamentarians working together to improve life for all Canadians. Bill C-230 is a bill that would make Canada an international leader in addressing environmental, social, and public health issues that impact Indigenous, Black, and other racialized and vulnerable communities from coast to coast to coast. This issue has become even more urgent, I would say, in light of the growing public awareness of systemic racism and the epidemic of racism, misogyny, gender-based violence, and femicide that the COVID-19 pandemic has stoked, since it has disproportionately impacted vulnerable communities. So please do the right thing, colleagues, and support Bill C-230. The strategy must include measures to examine the link between race and socioeconomic status and environmental risk, collect information and statistics relating to the location of environmental hazards, collect information and statistics relating to negative health outcomes in communities that have been affected, and assess the administration and enforcement of environmental laws in each province, as well as addressing environmental racism, including relation to possible amendments to federal laws, policies, and programs, the involvement of community groups in environmental policy making, and compensation for individuals or communities, ongoing funding for affected communities, and access of affected communities to clean air and water. So with that, colleagues, I will leave it, and
Thank you.
Dr. Waldron will continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Waldron. The screen is yours.
Dear members of the Environment and Sustainability Committee, I would like to thank you for inviting me to speak to Bill C-230 and environmental racism more broadly. I would like to begin by addressing arguments, persistent arguments over the years that since race is not a biological fact, systemic racism could not possibly exist in Canada. Indeed, it is the case that race is neither genetically programmed nor a biological fact. For example, there are no genetic characteristics possessed by all Black people, but not by non-Black people. There is no gene or cluster of genes common to all white people, but not to non-white people. Different races are not marked by important differences in gene frequencies. However, while race is not a biological fact, it is a fact that race has been and continues to be used to categorize and divide people based on physical traits, such as skin color, hair texture, facial features, etc., and to include and exclude based on these physical traits. Society is racialized, and race is part of that social reality. Race developed over the years as a principle of social organization and identity formation. Humans create divisions and produce racial categories. Race has social currency and is used as a basis to deny certain groups access to various resources, services, and opportunities. Systemic racism is indeed a reality in Canada and around the world. Systemic racism refers to the laws, rules, and norms woven into our social systems that result in the unequal distribution of resources, such as the denial of access, participation, and equity to racialized people for services such as education, employment, and housing. Racism, systemic racism, manifests in the policies, practices, and procedures within our systems that may directly or indirectly promote, sustain, or entrench differential advantage or privilege for people of certain races. In other words, race is a material reality. I should know, I am Black, that has consequences for people on the ground. The material reality and consequences of racism for Indigenous, Black, and other racialized groups in Canada include higher rates of unemployment, higher rates of income insecurity, higher rates of poverty, segregation in poor neighborhoods, poorer health outcomes, disproportionate exposure to environmental hazards due to the placement of dangerous projects by government. Environmental racism, then, is a form of systemic racism because it manifests in environmental policymaking and decision-making in ways that disproportionately burden certain communities through the placement or siting of environmentally dangerous projects in their communities. Why is Bill C-230 important? It is urgent that we address over 70 years of environmental racism that has disproportionately impacted those communities. Communities whose social and economic well-being and health have already been compromised by long-standing structural determinants of health, such as unemployment and underemployment, over-policing and over-incarceration, income insecurity and poverty, food insecurity, and housing insecurity. Bill C-230 would provide the government with a framework to examine how race, socioeconomic status, and residence in remote areas that are near environmental hazards intersect to shape health outcomes in these communities. Bill C-230 would also provide affected communities with opportunities to be involved in environmental policymaking and decision-making, which they have been excluded from. It is important that the communities that are most burdened by the siting of hazardous projects in their communities be given opportunities to have a say in what happens in their communities. In conclusion, it is important to state that in the case of environmental policymaking, a rising tide does not lift all boats. The approach to environmental policymaking in Canada has reflected a kind of universalism that suggests that if environmental burdens experienced by all Canadians are addressed, those who are most affected by those burdens will benefit. The notion that environmental policy should not focus on specific racial groups dismisses the long history of placing these hazardous projects in our most vulnerable communities. It is an approach that has failed since polluting industries continue to be disproportionately located in these same communities. The truth is, policies work best when they are strategic and directly target the social ills in communities that are most affected. Therefore, it is crucial that we have legislation that centers race in environmental policy making and decision making, since the communities that are disproportionately harmed are those that are racialized. And once again, race is real. It has material realities. My hope then is that Bill C-230 is that legislation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Waldron. So we'll go to our first round of questions, and it will be led off by Mr. Albes for 6 minutes, please.
Great. I'd like to thank witnesses for being here today.
Merci, Madame Waldron, pour être parmi nous aujourd'hui, et merci à la députée Sarah. Dans vos commentaires d'ouverture, vous avez mentionné l'importance de l'air pur et de l'eau propre pour tous les Canadiens. Hier, votre...
Oh, let's take a pause.
Sorry, Mr. Albes.
So, are you're getting the French on the? Do you hear me in English now?
Yes, I can hear in English now.
Et si je parle français, là, vous entendez la traduction en anglais?
No, I didn't.
Can you get the translation into English when I speak in French?
Maybe our clerk can communicate with.
I heard it now. I heard it now, Chair.
It's good. We're back on track. Okay. Sorry.
These
Mr.
things
Albus,
happen,
yeah.
Mr. Chair.
Yeah.
Appreciate the MP Saney jumping in there.
Mr. Albus, can you start from the beginning, because I missed about 15 to 20 seconds of your opening remark.
Okay.
And I'm always want to listen to what you say.
Okay, MP Zan, thank you for your time here today. I would just, in your opening comments, you mentioned clean air and clean water. Specifically, I'd like to say that yesterday, the Minister of Environment tabled a bill amending the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. And part of the promise that your government made was that there would be clean air and clean water standards, national standards in it, yet there wasn't anything in there. Are you disappointed in your government?
No, I'm actually thrilled to be part of this government. I think it's the greenest government I've ever been part of, and I've been part of a few now. So I believe that this is the right track, and that this bill can dovetail nicely with changes to the Environmental Protection Act. And I think that this is the beginning, and I look forward to seeing where we go.
So you believe that actions where you say things and then do not follow through on them is a good thing?
I don't think we should politicize this at all. I think that we should stick to what the facts
I'm asking about
are
CEPA.
And what the matter is. We're not talking about CEPA. We're talking about Bill C-230. So let's stick to that, please.
Well, you did in your opening comments mention that every Canadian has a right to that, and that's something that your government said in the CEPA legislation, that it promised it would commit to putting forward national standards for clean air and for clean water. And now you've said that you're proud of being a part of a government that promises something and doesn't deliver. Isn't that a problem?
Don't put words into my mouth, colleague, please. That's not what we're here for today. Thank you very much.
Oh, okay. Well, so we'll get back to your bill then, since you don't want to answer regards to your government. So I guess I'll save that for Minister Wilkinson. So I would like to simply ask you about your bill. So do you believe that adding another strategy that will probably take a number of years, followed by more government delays, I think that won't solve problem. Obviously, action will. So why do you think a delay by focusing on a strategy is a better plan than actually getting to work on specific problems?
Well, thank you for the question. And I'd like to say in response that I listened very intently to your speech in the House, where you denied actually systemic racism and told me I should be ashamed of myself for suggesting that racism exists in Canada. So I'd like to put it back to you to say, have you changed your mind now, and do you accept this premise?
Well, considering we are inspecting your bill, I can simply say that I gave representation specifically on the difference between the First Nations and how they're treated under the Indian Act in my region of the Okanagan, and how the same penalties would be hundreds of thousands of dollars if it had been done on one side of the river channel versus the other. So I simply said there are two different ways of dealing with issues of environmental protection and pointed to those gaps. Again, you are talking about a strategy than concrete action. Your government promised to solve all boil water advisories and has failed to do so. Solving problems is the government's problems. So when questioned by a resident of Grassy Narrows who was begging to help the Prime Minister, he said, no, thanks for the donation. No one doubts the Liberals' ability to hire consultants and draft reports. What is needed here is results. Why not push for action now, not action in a few years when a strategy is done?
This is the beginning of action, the same as when we did the missing and murdered women. We needed a report on that. We need a report, we need data in order to be able to deal with the issues facing us today. And I have to say that if you're more concerned about how much money it's going to cost to actually deal with these issues, then that's a very sad thing, because I think that we need to do the right thing and we need to listen to our constituents. And yes, racism does exist, and environmental racism does exist, and we need to deal with it. And that's why we're here today.
So Liberal members are fond of saying that we don't care about vulnerable Canadians, but what we want is to have them see results. Now, a consultant drafted strategy, by the way, your government has spent over $6 billion, the highest amount on consultants. So a consultant drafted strategy will take 2 years, won't help anyone, but liberally connected consultants and insiders. So meanwhile, First Nations all over Canada don't have clean water. I would suggest that we pull up our sleeves and get to work on helping people. What problems for which people need solutions right now? Not in 2 years, right now. Could you please tell me who will be directly helped in your bill right now?
I'm actually
30 seconds.
I'm going to ask Dr. Waldron to answer that question.
Mr. Chair, I'm asking MP Zan. She's a witness here.
Well, I mean,
Mr. Chair, I get control of my time. I've asked an MP for her results. She can.
Point of order.
It's her bill.
I think we have to listen to the chair.
Yeah, just a second. I mean, I take your point. I'm just going to stop the time for a second. I take your point, Mr. Albus. But you do understand that,
Mr. Chair, it is my 5 minutes, and I've asked a question of a member.
Yeah, but your time is stopped, so I'm not taking time away from you. But just by way of analogy, sometimes,
Mr. Chair, whose time is it?
Well, right now
point of order, Mr. Chair.
Time because it's
point of order. Can we hear what the chair has to say?
The time is stopped.
The chair can assert himself just fine. I've asked the question.
Point of order.
The MP is Mr. Chair. Who's in charge of the meeting here?
Mr. Chair.
Is the witnesses get to direct who answers what?
No, I'm not.
I
didn't disagree with your point. I just want to make an analogy because sometimes when officials come and we ask an official a question, the official will defer to another official, and we don't seem to have a problem with that. But Ms.
She can choose not to answer. That's fine. And
yeah,
we'll just end this round.
It's up to you, Ms. Zan, if you want to answer the question.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Yeah.
I guess I'm a bit disappointed with Mr. Albus that I believe I had an intervention not too long ago, and he was outraged that I didn't respect the authority of the chair, and him talking over you is not appropriate. And this whole line of questioning is bizarre on a bill that I believe we all agreed to, but this is, well, it wasn't debate when you were speaking, Mr. Albus, and I believe I'm the one who has the floor. You'd like to interrupt everyone. That's a little disappointing. But Mr. Chair, it's I would hope that Mr. Albus would respect your ability to.
Yeah, I'm not taking time from anyone right now. So anyway, I guess what I'm going to say is, Ms. Zan, Mr. Albus would like you to answer the question. If you don't want to answer the question, that's fine. He didn't address it to Dr. Waldron. Dr. Waldron, if Mr. Albus wants, can answer the question, but it's his time. So he can either you can either take if you don't want to answer, then he can take an answer from Dr. Waldron, or
Thank you, Chair. I didn't
not,
say I didn't want to answer
or let the time go. That's so. Yes, Ms. Zan, do you want to answer?
Yes. To be honest, it's been so long now with all this bickering back and forth. I don't even remember what the question was. So what was the question?
I'd be happy to ask it again, MP Zan. So what I said is people need solutions right now, not in 2 years. This is a strategy. Who will be helped by this bill right now? As I said, we have boiled water advisories that need to be fixed.
I completely agree with you on the boiled water advisories. And in fact, our government is doing everything we can to try to stop the pollution that is going on right now that is preventing people from getting the clean water. But here's the deal. The majority of environmental groups and First Nations people and Black communities across this country are cheering for this bill right now, and they would like to see it in place because it will make a difference to their lives, and that's why I'm here.
Okay, thank you. So, Mr. Baker, for 6 minutes.
Thanks very much, Chair, and Ms. Zahn, congratulations on your bill, and Dr. Waldron, thank you for being here, and I'm going to ask you about your bill during my time in questioning. I wanted to start, Ms. Zahn, I have a few questions I want to ask you, and so I'm going to ask you to kind of help me budget the time. We'll see how it goes. Could you just articulate for us, to begin with, how, if enacted, Bill C-230 would help reduce or eliminate environmental racism in Canada?
Thanks very much, MP Baker. Personally, I started a long time ago with Ingrid Waldron talking about environmental racism in Nova Scotia, and we were able to clock and map the entire province where we could see the disproportionate number of communities that were placed on or beside toxic sites, and they were Indigenous and Black communities. Dr. Waldron has done further research now and discovered that, in fact, this is the case across Canada. So it is our intent with this bill to be able to consult with communities right across the country who are affected, and to document what are the health effects, what are the health disaffects that have been produced by the proximity to these toxic places. If you don't have the data, you can't do anything. And unfortunately, both women and racialized people have been basically ignored for too many years. And it's time for us to start to collect that data now, and then we can act to prevent this from continuing.
Thank you. And if you had that data, can you give me an example of how that could lead to resolving this issue of environmental racism?
Yes, well, for instance, here in Nova Scotia, there was a poster child for environmental racism, which was a pulp mill that was putting toxic waste into a beautiful, once pristine lagoon where Indigenous peoples had gathered for picnics and swimming and gathering clams and things for thousands of years. And for the last 60 years, it was the containment for effluent from the pulp mill. This was contributing to cancers in the area, to breathing problems of people in the area. And our government here in Nova Scotia did recognize that, and we passed a bill called the Boat Harbor Act to close that effluent off and to tell the company that they needed to come up with another solution rather than continuing to pollute that area. And that has now happened. So this is the type of thing that we need to start looking at. We can't continue to putting our waste into fresh water and into places where we're going to be affecting the health of people. I think the health of people need to come first, and the environment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've got two more questions in about 2.5 minutes. So the first question is, I think some of my constituents are watching, certainly some of yours will be watching, and many of our respective constituents are watching. And as you indicated, Ms. Zahn, in your remarks, not everyone's familiar with this concept of environmental racism. If you had to, could you define for us what the term environmental racism means for our benefit, but also for the benefit of folks watching?
Yes, I did mention it at the beginning of my time, but it's the disproportionate number of toxic waste sites, dumps, and other corporate polluters that are placed on or beside racialized communities, mainly Black and First Nations communities, but other communities as well that lack socioeconomic power and therefore the power to be able to speak out.
Okay, thank you. And during debate of Bill C-230 in the House, the government signaled support for your bill, and the government also highlighted areas that it would seek amendments to address some concerns it had with the bill. These included incorporating principles of environmental justice, of which environmental racism is an aspect of that, addressing issues that would be more appropriately taken on by the provinces or impact provincial jurisdiction, and providing certain flexibility in the development of a national strategy to avoid prejudging the outcome of the work that would be undertaken. Are you open to amendments to your bill in these areas?
Yes, absolutely. Anything that will strengthen the bill, I'm definitely in favor of. And I also want to recognize that Quebec has a sovereignty that they are concerned about protecting. And I would like to address the MP from the Bloc Québécois concerns about that and say, yes, I'm definitely open to amendments that would be in keeping with consulting with the provinces and making sure that they feel comfortable with this. And I know that they care about environmental issues, so I would hope that they will reconsider their stance on this and come on board. Thank you. Merci.
Thanks so much. And I think I don't have enough time for another question, but I'll just congratulate you on your bill. As someone who's worked on private members' bills in the past, I know how much work it takes and how hard it is to move it through the process. And you've moved it a long way through this process. And I congratulate you for that, and congratulate you for you're fighting for equality for all Canadians, as far as I'm concerned. And I really respect that. So thank you.
Merci, Monsieur Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Baker. We'll now go to Ms. Posey for 6 minutes. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ms. Zan and Ms. Waldron, for being here today. You are quite right. Health and the environment are very closely linked. Yesterday, though, the government and the Minister of the Environment introduced an update to CEPA, the Environmental Protection Act. There are two important clauses in that bill: a right to a healthy environment and protection of vulnerable populations. That being the case, Ms. Zan, do you not feel that the government's bill, which is greater in scope and seems to have more enforcement in it, will make your bill necessary?
Merci. J'apprécie beaucoup.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your question.
I think that the government's bill yesterday is a very good step forward, and I'm very pleased to see it. Obviously, a private member's bill takes a lot longer to get through the House. It has to go through all of these various different levels and then go to the Senate. And, you just never know. It might even get stalled in the Senate. It's a lot harder to get a private member's bill passed. So I'm very pleased to see what happened yesterday. And again, I think that this bill would dovetail nicely with CEPA, with the changes to CEPA. But I believe that it's important that we as a government put the emphasis also on race, as Dr. Waldron had expressed, because this is not necessarily been...
That's fine, but I want to bring you back to Quebec. In Quebec, the right to live in a healthy environment with respect for diversity has been recognized since 2006 and is recognized in our charter. So it's a quasi-constitutional right that protects all Quebecers. So I wonder how useful it is to bring in legislation that has very similar provisions. Do you not think that the bill should have actually defined this rather than leaving it in the have this really entrenched rather than just talking about environmental racism and the definition in the preamble?
Well, merci. Thank you for your questions. First of all, I want to commend Quebec for so many of your progressive things that you do there, including arts and culture, early childhood education, affordable childcare. I'm a big fan of what you do there, and the care is so important. But again, I do think that it's important that we introduce a bill that will address the issues of systemic racism and environmental racism, which has been affecting Canada. And I want to work with the province of Quebec. We want to work with the province of Quebec to make sure that we can make things better right across Canada and in Quebec. And I'd be open to your suggestions as well. Thank you.
Thank you. You will understand that for us, because of Quebec being an exceptional jurisdiction, we have less interest in Bill C-28 and other types of legislation than other provinces. I want to talk about something that is very basic to our party, which is environmental sovereignty. Not just the Bloc Québécois, but even the Quebec government adheres very closely to these values. We work to protect the environment, and we have priority over federal legislation because we have control over our environment under our jurisdiction on our territory. So here with Bill C-230, there is a direct challenge to our jurisdiction, and the aim is to control the application of these rules. Are you aware of the constitutional realities of Canada and the fact that Quebec is in a special situation? So how do you see this bill coming into that context?
Absolument. I
Absolutely
accept and recognize Quebec's special situation. And I think that it would be incumbent upon us as a government to directly work with you and work with Quebec to try and make this bill work for you as well. I think it's important, again, to set a symbol to the rest of the world that Canada means what we say when we're going to deal with racism, systemic racism, and environmental racism. And I think it doesn't matter where in Canada it is, but it has taken place, and environmental racism is a real thing. So I would open my arms and say, let's work together and make this work for all of us. But thank you.
Parfait. Alors, on passe.
We'll now go to Mr. Bachrach. It's your turn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you so much to Ms. Zan for bringing forward your bill. Congratulations, and thank you to Dr. Waldron for your presentation. I know 5 minutes doesn't come close to being enough time to get into all of the impact and meaning behind this bill that's in front of us. The definition of environmental racism that you presented is such a succinct one, and I think for many Canadians, they would understand it intuitively as being an egregious problem. When I think about systemic or environmental racism in the region that I represent in Northwest British Columbia, I think about the disproportionate impact of global climate change on Indigenous people who rely on resources like wild salmon, especially. Indigenous nations like the Wet'suwet'en, the Gitxsan, the Tsimshian, the Heiltsuk, the Niska, all up and down the north and central coast of British Columbia. And I talk to people every single week who are heartbroken at the changes they're seeing in the environment around them. And they want justice for their kids, and they want to see action so that these resources come back in more abundance. Now my question to you, and I wonder if you could just unpack this a little bit for me, because the definition you presented seems, it seems like a toxic waste site sited near a racialized community is very different as a problem from something like global climate change and the impact on Indigenous people. Perhaps you could just share with us a little bit of your thinking about how climate change is dealt with by your bill, and how it might be strengthened to better consider those disproportionate impacts of climate on Indigenous people.
Thank you very much. And actually, again, anything that will strengthen this bill, I am totally open to, as long as it doesn't water it down and weaken it. Dr. Waldron and I have discussed at length the fact that climate change and environmental racism are inextricably connected. Women are connected too, because it's affected women disproportionately. And so climate change obviously makes the rapid changing of our climate in proportion with even the pandemic, the fact that the pandemic is also happening and is affecting more racialized people and women. They're all connected. That's why I believe that having a bill like this that puts a spotlight on the fact that racialized people have been ignored for too long, and that their health has been affected disproportionately than white people. And that's why I think we need to have this bill now and bring this attention to this issue, because it's been ignored for too long.
Thank you, Ms. Zan. I wonder if Dr. Waldron, if you'd like to comment on climate as a form of environmental racism.
Yeah, so there's a climate justice movement, a burgeoning climate justice movement in Canada and around the world. And that movement demonstrates quite clearly that environmental racism, the placement of polluting industries in certain communities, is inextricably linked to climate change in several ways. So the kind of emissions that come out of polluting industries actually have implications for climate change. The same communities that are disproportionately impacted by environmental racism are the same communities that are disproportionately impacted by climate change. The structural inequities, separate from climate change, separate from environmental racism, the longstanding structural inequities that Black and Indigenous peoples in this country experience actually put them at risk. People don't often talk about what exactly puts people at risk. It's not just geography. It's not just where Indigenous people live. It's about the structural inequities, whether it be poor housing, neighborhoods with poor quality public infrastructure, food insecurity, housing insecurity, income insecurity, undereducation. Those are the structural inequities that put communities at risk for climate change, as well as for the placement of polluting industries in their communities. Then when we talk about the after effects, these are communities, because of the longstanding structural inequities they've faced, find it much harder in terms of climate change to fight back against climate change, to come back from climate change, to address climate change, because as Lenore mentioned earlier, those are the communities that have less clout. They have less political, economic, and social clout. They don't have the networks. They don't have this thing that we call social capital, right, that allows them to come back from climate change quickly. In terms of environmental racism, part of the definition of environmental racism is not simply the location of polluting industries in those communities. There's a kind of a 5-part definition of environmental racism. And so Lenore talked about the disproportionate location, but it's also about the lack of political power these communities have for resisting the placement of industrial polluters in their communities. It's about the implementation of policies that sanction the harmful and in many cases life-threatening poisons in these communities. It's about the disproportionate negative impacts of environmental policies that result in differential rates of cleanup, but it's also about the history in Canada of excluding Indigenous and racialized communities from mainstream or environmental groups, boards, commissions, regulatory bodies, decision-making bodies, right? So essentially, this is about systemic racism. It's about the issues, the structural inequities, separate, independent of climate change, independent of environmental racism, that in the first place puts these communities at risk. At the back end, it's about the fact that that lack of clout makes it much more difficult for them to come back and address it. So these are issues that are inextricably linked, and I think in Canada, people are starting to see those links. And then we talk about the identities, race, gender, the fact that women around the world bear the brunt of climate change impacts, particularly in developing countries. And that, you know, we also need to think of, when we think of policy, we need to look at those intersections of race and class, socioeconomic status, and gender. Because what I've seen in Nova Scotia is that it's the Indigenous women that I've noticed that seem to be on the front lines. They're the ones who are doing much of the work in terms of addressing it, right? Because it's part of their culture, it's part of their tradition.
Unfortunately, our time is up for the NDP segment, but you'll have an opportunity. You'll have an opportunity, Dr. Waldron, to continue with your line of thinking, perhaps in response to other questions. So we'll go now to the second round. Ms. McLeod for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. And I do want to pick up, first of all, in the area of provincial jurisdiction. And I think Madame Posey spoke to that particular concern. You know, I noticed throughout the pandemic, I mean, we have a constitution in Canada. We have not only Quebec that has special concerns, but I think it's fair to say that, you know, every province wants to be have their jurisdiction respected, whether it's Alberta, whether it's British Columbia. And so for you to sort of say that measures will be undertaken and that you're going to assess the effect of environmental laws in each province, I mean, to me, that's terribly, you know, father knows best, very, you know, I don't see the provinces appreciating that kind of intervention into what is clearly their area of jurisdiction. So that's sort of my first area of concern. And as I say, it's not just Quebec. You talked about Quebec, but you didn't sort of say, you know what, maybe there's some other provinces that won't really appreciate that. So are you willing to remove that section period, because it clearly interferes in provincial jurisdiction, and it's clearly a father knows best. And, you know, quite frankly, British Columbia has done some very good things over the years, and for the federal government to impose upon them their thoughts, I think is, again, very patronizing.
Thank you very much, and thanks for your question. Actually, all the bill talks about is consultation with. So it's right in the bill. It says that in developing the strategy, the minister must consult with representatives of provincial and municipal governments, of Indigenous communities, and of other affected communities, as well as any other affected persons and bodies. So it's about consultation, not telling the provinces what to do. This is about gathering the information and then reporting back to government with recommendations.
I mean, certainly assessing the environmental laws in each province is, you know, from my perspective, a little bit more. But so my next area that I'd like to talk about, I do want to quickly follow up because there has been sort of reference made to the missing and murdered Indigenous women. I sat on a special committee for over a year. I read over 70 different studies on that issue that had been formally done. We had recommendations. You know, I acknowledge that the inquiry was ultimately supported by all parties, but then there was a plan to have an action plan, which is something that people have been asking all along, is an action plan. And of course, that's been delayed. It was supposed to be last June. We're still waiting for an action plan on that. So, you know, what I'm worried about is what my colleague worries about. Instead of having something specific that's going to make a real difference, like saying, you know, participation will be X on this committee, or, you know, in British Columbia, one of my First Nations had their own environmental assessment process that was part of planning around a mine. So instead of doing something that actually is going to make a difference, what we have is wait, dialogue, wait and see. I mean, there is some things that should be very specific. So, you know, if the example of murdered and missing, which you held out as a good example, when I still see no action plan, no action, and the horrific incidents that are still happening in our communities across the country, it certainly doesn't give me any relief that this bill would move us in a positive direction.
Thank you. Well, I have to agree with you. What is happening is outrageous and disgusting with regards to the way women are treated, and the femicide, toxic masculinity. All of these issues need to be addressed, and addressed now. I think that this bill obviously isn't going to go that far. This is about environmental racism, but they're all connected. And therefore, again, you were concerned about whether or not the government was going to tell the provinces what to do, but actually what we're doing is consulting with the provinces and affected communities, and then making recommendations as to how we can change things.
Okay, so the way I'm seeing things, and I can use some other examples. So for example, there are environmental projects that actually had been approved by the process. Your government shut them down, where Indigenous people were keen for them to move forward. And I can give you example after example of projects. So if you're talking about is not economic opportunity, it's this is about decision making. This is not about and having structures in place for appropriate decision making and including community. So again, I'll use First Nations because certainly in British Columbia and the riding I represent, they need to play a critical role in yes or no's to projects. And what I'm hearing is a process, again, paternalistic.
Okay, but
it's
we're out of time.
Consultation.
Yeah, we're unfortunately out of time. We'll go to Ms. Sachs for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to thank my colleague, Ms. Zahn, for this important bill that's brought forward to committee. And Dr. Waldron, I've been reading up on your work, and I'm pleased to see you here today. I'd like to pick up on some of the questioning of my colleague, Mr. Bacharach, to allow Ms. Waldron to unpack perhaps a little bit more, because I think this is an important point to why we're here today discussing C-230. And can you speak to the manifestations of systemic racism as it affects environmental policy? Since we are going to be going through a process of unpacking policy, you know, we do have dark episodes in our very own Canadian history that are more easily identifiable, such as the residential school system. But environmental racism truly might be a less direct or less visible issue that Canadians don't really understand why this matter is so important and why my colleague Ms. Zahn felt it was so important to bring this to the House and to committee. So how might systemic racism become manifest in our environmental policies?
The spatial patterning of industries, primarily in Indigenous and other racialized communities, is an outcome of systemic racism that has been inscribed within environmental policy, not dissimilar from any other policy, whether you're talking about health policy, policy in education, immigration policy. It stems from the people who get to make decisions. The people who get to make decisions are never people who look like me, typically. Yes, one or two, but this is once again about power. So when we look at departments of environment, the people who have the most power, the people who get to write policies are those who are middle class and white. Directly or indirectly, knowingly or unknowingly, as people, we hold beliefs, perceptions about other people, and we certainly hold beliefs about those who are othered. Those ideologies and beliefs and perceptions that we hold about those who are considered to be other, they get inscribed within environmental policies in very, very, very subtle ways. And that's why we call it systemic racism, because it's not overt, it's not direct, it's subtle, it's silent. And the way it gets inscribed within environmental policy is through ideologies that determine who matters and who doesn't. That's very difficult for white people to admit to, I understand. But we all hold what we call unconscious biases. And when you write those policies, in very subtle ways, you want to make sure that your group is protected. Okay. And that was highlighted to me during a presentation I gave at Dalhousie when a white student stood up and said to me after I gave a talk, she said, "So what are you proposing, Dr. Waldron, that they put it in our community?" And when she said that, I said, there we go, right? So we may not want to admit that, but we hold ideas about who matters, who doesn't matter, who has value and who doesn't value. And if we are honest with ourselves, we know that people who look like myself and Indigenous people in this country and around the world are seen as having less value and less worth.
I understand.
So we are not the individuals you choose to protect over your group. And that's how.
Okay, not to interrupt you too much, just so that we can continue with the questioning. So we are talking about the agency, really, in a lot of this, of the agency of communities and the agency to be able to change our perspectives, and the benefit of this bill and the assessment process that is proposed will allow us to look at some of those things. So do you see C-230 as providing a benefit in addressing systemic racism through these series of assessments on the provincial level and also on the federal level. Our federal government, as part of its throne speech, made a commitment to looking at systemic racism, and this is an integral part of that as far as for ICID. And I'd like to hear from you and also from Ms. Zahn, depending on my time that the chair will let me know.
There's 30 seconds left, so
okay.
This is another form of systemic racism, environmental racism. We've got racism in housing. We have racism in health. We have racism in education. We have racism in every single social structure in this country and in every country around the world. So I'm not sure if I remember your question, but
will the C230 provide us a way to begin to address systemic racism in terms of the environment?
Yeah, because as Lenore said, you can't address a problem unless you know what the problem is. And the collection of race-based data for this bill, the collection of race-based data by race and socioeconomic status and environmental risk and also health outcomes is really crucial. We know what's happening, right? I do work on qualitative issues. I have the stories of the communities, but we also need the statistics, right? So those two things, the stories that many of us have shared over the years, as well as the statistics, provides a context for government to say, oh, okay, this is what is happening. Now we can address it.
We'll have to move on to Mme. Posey, please, for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you. Ms. Waldron, I would like to ask a question of you. Ms. Zahn said earlier that you had carried out studies across Canada. So I would like to talk about something that's close to my heart, which is nuclear waste. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Chalk River, which isn't far from Ottawa, and all of the debate about sending nuclear waste to Labrador. We know that that there could be small modular reactors used in places where there are a lot of Indigenous people. They need power, but also they don't need the waste that comes with it. And the federal government has nuclear under its jurisdiction. What do you think about nuclear waste and where it should go?
Is that for Ingrid or Dr. Waldron?
Yes, it is for Dr. Waldron.
Go ahead, Dr. Waldron.
Oh, I have no idea where it should go, but I do know that it shouldn't go in an Indigenous community again, right? So that's what I guess environmental assessments are for, right? Environmental assessments are about determining where particular projects go. And thus far, environmental assessments have not been equitable. They haven't considered existing vulnerabilities in Indigenous and other communities. They haven't considered the social, what we call the social determinants of health. So the question of where something should go is not my role, because I'm a professor, but it's the role of the people who make those decisions. But what I'm asking is for the people who make those decisions through an environmental assessment or whatever tool they use to make decisions that are considered, that consider existing vulnerabilities in these communities. These communities have had, as I said, long-standing structural inequities due to colonialism, and to make sure that what they do doesn't further compromise their social well-being and health. So I have no idea where it should go, but what I'm asking and what this bill can do is to ensure that government makes much more considered decisions and that assessments look at the full context of these communities, the social, economic, political context, their health, their vulnerability before they make decisions that will further compromise the well-being of these communities.
We just have time for a very short comment. I don't have much time, but just a few seconds. You really don't have enough time, but you have time for a comment without asking for an answer. So I will just make a comment to Ms. Waldron. I would like to have, if you could do a follow-up on this, some information about your projects, your research that you've done that apply to all of Canada. I know that Ms. Zahn comes from Nova Scotia, and that's where you are too, but I would like to know what you have that applies to all of Canada.
No, that's a bit incorrect.
No, it's not a question. I mean, we don't have time for an answer. It was a comment. You know, it was if you could provide this information to the committee, Madame Posey would appreciate it. So we'll go to Mr. Backrack for basically 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Picking up with Dr. Waldron, you mentioned something about the social determinants of health and also this idea of clout and decision-making power. I know that you've identified Indigenous-led environmental assessments as a key way of addressing environmental racism. I wonder if you could expand on why that's an important strategy. And then the second part of my question is around the presence of poverty in communities. And obviously, poverty is also a powerful social determinant of health, and how that interacts with this idea of decision-making power, because often these toxic sites come with revenue, especially in a modern context, and how those decisions play out and potentially complicate this question of environmental health.
So some Indigenous communities have asked for Indigenous-led environmental assessments because they have felt excluded. You know, there's this term, as you know, participatory democracy. It's not simply about including people in decision making, but also by the way in which you do that, right? In culturally specific ways. So Indigenous-led environmental assessments would allow not only Indigenous people to have a say at the get-go, not at the end, not at the middle, right at the start, on what's happening in their own communities, but it would also be done in a way that respects Indigenous ecological theory or model, right? So Euro-Western understandings of the environment, our understandings as kind of Euro-Western trained individuals, we see a separation between land and body and animals and plants. That's the classic Euro-Western understanding of the world. Indigenous people see it very differently. They have a holistic, much more holistic, and African peoples, a holistic understanding of our world. They see there's a connection between the land and the body and animals. Everything is one. So if you desecrate their land, you are harming them. You're harming their bodies, their communities, their health, and their well-being. An Indigenous-led assessment would allow for the incorporation of what is called Indigenous ways of knowing, right? Because one of the reasons why I think we do what we do is because we have a very different understanding than Indigenous people about the fact that if you're harming the land, you are going to harm me as a community. And people who are trained in Euro-Western ways of knowing don't really get that. They don't understand that. That's why we have this separation between you know, we have psychology departments, this separation from the body. We see the mind as very separate in Euro-Western philosophy. So Indigenous-led assessment would be about all of that. It would be about not just allowing them to be in the process from the get-go, but making sure it's done in culturally specific ways, making sure that, you know, you're doing it in their communities, making sure that you're communicating the information to them in culturally specific ways, making sure that they get to have their ways of knowing, Indigenous ways of knowing, Indigenous epistemologies incorporated into environmental assessments. In terms of poverty, poverty is a strong determinant of health, and all of the communities that we're talking about are not only racialized, they're also low income or poor, and they also live in remote areas. The intersection of poverty and race and residential patterns makes for the lack of power that these communities have to fight back against environmental racism.
Thank you. Okay, we'll go to Mr. Redekop, please.
Thank you. Just wanted to talk about back to water. I mean, it's an important thing for our committee. We're going to be doing a study shortly on that. And of course, clean water is huge, and I would suggest a primary objective of any environmental legislation. In fact, the very first committee meetings that we had a year ago, we met with the University of Saskatchewan Global Institute for Water Security to talk about this very thing. So, Ms. Zan, do you believe that clean water is something that all Canadians should have access to regardless of their income level or ethnic background?
Without a question. Yes.
Okay, great. And of course, earlier this year, the Auditor General released his report on drinking water communities, and the findings were that Indigenous Services Canada did not meet its commitment to eliminate long-term drinking water advisories in First Nations communities, and deficiencies for some water systems had not been addressed. Indigenous Services Canada had not amended the operations and maintenance funding formula for First Nations water systems since it was first developed 30 years ago, and a salary gap had contributed to problems in retaining.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Yes,
we're really venturing off the relevancy of this, of talking about this bill.
We're talking about.
Well, Mr.
And again, Mr. Redekop, I have the floor. Sorry, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, no, I go ahead, Mr. Biddle. I think I see where you're going with this, but yeah, continue for a few more seconds, and then I'll respond.
Unless there's a real tie back here to the bill in question, I know Mr. Albus did that at the start, but unless there's a tie back to this bill, we seem to just be really avoiding the relevancy, which is the bill at hand, which I think Mr. Redekop should really
point of order, Mr. Chair. Just I'd like to add to the point on relevancy.
Sure.
The member herself raised it in her opening statements about clean air and clean water. That other chairs have ruled that if someone does speak to them with their initial presentation, that it is within it. I imagine Mr. Redekop is going to be getting back to the bill itself, but I do think that that he deserves the ability to be able to state his case.
Yeah, no. I mean, it's a valid point in the sense that Indigenous communities have been sort of pushed into areas that don't have the best source water and so on, and the whole question of how this funding formula is developed. I think it's all relevant. I would just urge Mr. Redekop, once he's made the point, to maybe stop there instead of doing a litany of all the ills that he thinks our government has committed. But whatever, just go ahead, Mr. Redekop.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I understand how the Liberals do not like to hear these things, but it is the truth. And of course, I would suggest that we've already, through testimony, heard that the Indigenous communities are one of the main ones targeted by this legislation, and also clean air, clean water are the primary things we're talking about with environmental things. The Auditor General went on to say that many First Nations communities are particularly vulnerable to infectious diseases, such as the virus that causes coronavirus disease, because of social, environmental, and economic factors. So I guess my question is, the government, the Liberal Party government, has completely failed to keep the environment clean on First Nations reserves. How do you think that this will change if this legislation happens to get passed?
Thank you, Mr. Redekop. Thank you to my colleague. I want to say, first of all, I know that Saskatoon is very fortunate to be situated on the South Saskatchewan River, and so there's a plentiful supply of water there. But the problem with the First Nations water did not start with this government. It started a long time ago. And so its successive governments have not done enough to try and alleviate this problem. And we are doing our very best, and in the middle of a global pandemic as well. But we are working on it. We continue to work on it, and we will make sure that the water problems that are being unfortunately a problem right now in many of our First Nations communities are addressed.
Well, certainly the pandemic has been an issue for the last year, but for the first 4.5 years, there was no pandemic, and there was lots of opportunities to get this done. And
yes, and there were 15 years of a conservative government before that, or 12 years.
It makes me wonder,
so why didn't they do something?
The question for you then is, you've introduced this as a private member's bill. Did you do that because you're concerned that the Liberal government, the way it is, would not address this issue any other way?
No, of course not. I introduced it because it was a private member's bill I had introduced in Nova Scotia with the help of Dr. Ingrid Waldron. And I believe that this is a very, very important issue. And my very first day after being sworn in Ottawa, I went straight to the legislative department of the lawyers to say, how do I do a private member's bill about this? And I was lucky to win the lottery and be one of the first 25 or so members of parliament to actually get to introduce a private member's bill. That's
so maybe for Dr. Waldron then, given that what we just spoke about, the lack of progress for clean drinking water that this government has had, should this legislation pass and be implemented, are you concerned that the government would be able to actually actually implement any of this in a positive way?
No, I think I'm always a hopeful person. That's just my personality. So I think the bill is very pointed. I mean, it's obviously just a bill. It's a page long, so it's not extremely detailed, but it speaks to all of the issues that are important to me in terms of the collection of data, the intersections of race and socioeconomic status. I feel like in this environment that people are willing to listen more. I think with everything that happened last year, I'm very hopeful that there will be movement on this because I think there's a different understanding about the issue. I think awareness has been raised over the past several years. I think the environment is right. I think the government is very interested right now in collecting information on systemic racism more broadly. I just feel that there's a right time, and then I just have a personality that's always really hopeful. And I'm so happy that I met Lenore because she's just like I am. She's persistent and consistent, and she is hopeful. And I believe that you attract negativity if you are negative. So I'm very positive about this. And I think at some point, it's this year, hopefully, I don't know what the process is like, it's going to move ahead. I believe in Lenore, and I'm here if I don't know whether or not I'm able to support, but I'm here if anybody wants any support or help.
Hope is a wonderful thing, but hope is not a management tool.
Okay, well, we'll have to go on now to Mr. Longfield. Maybe he'll speak about hope as well. So.
Hope and hard work. They go together very well. And thank you, Mr. Chair and Dr. Waldron. It's just a thrill to have you in our committee. And thank you so much, Lenore, for bringing us all together and for bringing this forward. I was speaking with a class at the University of Guelph last week, Ajay Sharma's class, the POLS 4280. And I said that we were going to be talking about environmental racism, and they were excited. They said, we don't usually hear governments putting those two things together. Dr. Waldron, if I could start with you, I'm thinking as you're speaking about Africville in Halifax and how it was, for several hundred years now, located by rail tracks. I've visited this. I've visited the original settlement community, garbage dump, industrial site, train tracks. The cheapest, dirtiest land you could find to put people on is where the Black community was located. We have intersections between municipal decisions on zoning, provincial decisions on environmental issues on site, and then possibly some federal guidelines in terms of setting direction for the country on what's acceptable and what's not acceptable in terms of how these locations are determined. In your work, have you been tying in the municipal, provincial, and federal, or so far municipal, provincial, and how does that look?
No, no, my work has actually just focused, so I haven't looked necessarily at the federal, right? But my work has mostly focused on the provincial, mostly, and Department of Environment. With Africville, it was the city of Halifax, of course, that created that problem. It was both, of course, a problem of gentrification or urban renewal, as well as environmental racism. But there has been a focus on provincial, but I am starting to venture more into other areas. I formed a new coalition late last year, a national coalition with various environmental and climate change groups, and we're hoping to do mapping across Canada. I've done that mapping for Nova Scotia, but I'm trying to look more broadly at Canada. So I would say that, yeah, for the past 9 years, it's been very focused on Nova Scotia, but I hope to change that.
Well, thank you. And thank you for that. And I think in terms of overall direction, and I know I've got very little time, this time always goes so quickly, but I'm thinking of, I've been fortunate to meet Sheila Watt-Kluche, an Inuit writer and also activist that's talked about in her book, The Right to Be Cold. She talked about the persistent organic pollutants that she's been advocating against for a number of years, where Inuit food supply is contaminated from southern pollutants. With the work that you're looking at, Ms. Zan, have you looked into Inuit communities apart from the urban discussions that we've just been having?
Well, I happen to be on the Northern and Indigenous Affairs Committee, and so we have had many witnesses talking about many different things, and I wouldn't even have time to go into all of them here. But I'm very aware of what's going on in Canada's North.
As we do our study, maybe we can compare notes in terms of witnesses that might be helpful that have contributed to some of that study work. And also, I did want to finish off with the role of the federal government in terms of setting directions. I mean, healthcare is provincial. Delivery of services quite often falls within municipal through public health. Federal government sets overall directions, similar with climate change initiatives. There are parallels where we work with Quebec, British Columbia, Alberta, other provinces to set directions. Is this also part of the mapping that I could, my screen keeps changing to Ms. Waldron. Have you looked at the political connections that need to be established in order for the federal government to play its role? You've already looked at the provincial government in Nova Scotia in a lot of detail. And could we include that in our study?
Yes, that's a difficult question for me to answer. I think I'm stumped.
Okay.
Yeah,
maybe
I guess
to Ms. Zan then, if you don't mind, because of my limited time. I don't want to be rude, but.
Well, let's make it clear. Dr. Waldron is, as she has said, she's a professor.
Right.
She's not a politician.
Right.
And it's not her job to politicize or anything like that. That's our job. Our job is to try and talk to the provinces and talk to the municipalities and do the consultations with the First Nations and the Black communities and the communities that have been affected. And when you start talking to the communities in your writings, you'll be surprised at how much environmental racism actually has been taking place for so long.
And boiled water advisories.
Yeah, go ahead. One more comment, Mr. Longfield, then we'll have to.
An elder in Sulikout we were working with on boiled water advisories said, just stop polluting the water and we don't need to worry about boiled water advisories.
Thank you.
True that.
Okay, so I think what I'll do is this takes us to the end of this panel. Then we now have to. I don't know if the other witnesses are already on the call, or if we have to we'll take a brief pause to have them log in. Are they on? I don't think so.
They're ready to be logged in, sir.
Okay, let's log them in. Thank you so much, Dr. Waldron, for your testimony, and of course, Ms. Zan, for yours as well. And of course, you're free to stay on the line if you wish. It's entirely up to you. I'm
stay and listen, you mean?
Of course, yes.
Oh, great. Okay, I promise not to say anything. Thank you, Dr. Waldron.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Everybody.
In terms of the second round, second panel, I mean, it's very, very subjective here. I have in front of me sort of the speakers, all the way to a sixth round. But I think I'll start, if you don't mind, the committee. I'll start with the 6-minute round again. And I'm going to try to make sure that we sort of continue down the list, but sort of adapting it to the 6-minute round, followed by the 5-minute round, if that's okay with the committee. That way the block and the NDP get more time in principle. Yeah, okay. And if I mess up, let me know. I'm not too proud to admit that I may have gotten it wrong. So are Mr. Morin, Ms. Farquharson, Ms. Neve, Mr. Roberge, are they on the call now?
Yes, they are. Would you mind suspending for a minute, sir?
Yes, let's suspend, yes.
Thank you.
So I am Laura Farquharson and Director General of the Legislative and Regulatory Affairs Directorate of the Environmental Protection Branch and Environment and Climate Change Canada. And I'm not sure how much of that sound check you heard. So I'm accompanied by my colleagues from ECCC, Pascal Roberge, who's the Director of Program Integration Division for the National Pollutant Release Inventory at the Science and Technology Branch, and Silke Neve, who's the Director of Information and Indicators in the Strategic Policy Branch. As well, David Morin is here from Health Canada, and he's the Director General of the Safe Environments Directorate at the Healthy Environments and Consumer Safety Branch. Nous sommes heureux d'être ici aujourd'hui.
We're pleased to be here today to participate in your study of Bill C-230. As you know, this bill requires the Minister of Environment and Climate Change to develop a national strategy to redress the harm caused by environmental racism in consultation with provincial, territorial, and municipal governments and Indigenous and other affected communities, persons, and bodies. This bill comes at a time when, as public servants, we are seized with issues around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and with combating systemic racism.
Focus on some of the proposed or existing legislative or policy frameworks that, to some extent address the subject matter of this bill, and then turn to David, who will speak about Health Canada's role in protecting the health of Canadians from environmental risks. Vous avez
I think that you talked earlier about the definition of environmental racism, and you know then that there is no commonly accepted definition. Usually we hear about racial discrimination, and this would apply in an environmental context. And certain vulnerable communities are disproportionately affected by environmental pollution, for example, dumps and polluted air. The existing legislation guarantees that the government works to protect the environment for all Canadians, including for vulnerable populations.
Tabled Bill C-28, which aims to strengthen the Canadian Environmental Protection Act 1999 with a particular focus on recognizing the right to a healthy environment as provided under that act. And if passed, the Minister of Environment and Climate Change and the Minister of Health will be required to develop an implementation framework to set out how a healthy environment will be considered in the administration of the act. And among other things, the implementation framework will elaborate on principles such as environmental justice and non-regression. Interested persons, stakeholders, partners will have an opportunity to participate in the development of the implementation framework. And in addition, the ministers are required to conduct research, studies, or monitoring activities to support the government in the protection of a right to a healthy environment. And this requirement could, for instance, assist in addressing environmental justice issues. For example, it could include the collection and analysis of data to identify and monitor populations and communities that are particularly vulnerable to environmental and health risks. Additional amendments proposed in the bill tabled yesterday would recognize in the preamble the importance of considering vulnerable populations and cumulative effects, and codify a number of new elements, including the definition of vulnerable population, requiring the Minister of Health to conduct biomonitoring surveys, which may include vulnerable populations, ensuring that vulnerable populations and cumulative effects are taken into account when developing and implementing the new plan of chemical management priorities, and requiring that the ministers consider available information on vulnerable populations and cumulative effects when conducting and interpreting risk assessments. To turn to another area of work, ECC has been working closely with Indigenous Services Canada.
Yeah, we're almost at 5. We're at 5 minutes, so we're going to have to go to Mr. Morin.
Okay.
Mr. Morin, there'll be time to answer questions and so on, and get the points across. Mr. Morin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Good afternoon. As my colleague Laura Farquharson indicated, my name is David Morin, and I'm the Director General of the Safe Environments Directorate at Health Canada.
I welcome this opportunity to discuss Health Canada's role in protecting the health of Canadians from environmental risks. Specifically, I would like to spend the next few minutes speaking to Health Canada's activities related to the health of Indigenous peoples and racialized communities and the environmental health risks that they face. This includes risks associated with exposure to toxic chemicals, air pollution, and water pollution.
Chemicals represents an ongoing health risk facing Indigenous peoples and racialized communities, as well as other vulnerable populations. In response, Health Canada has been working to better integrate specific considerations for vulnerable populations when conducting chemical risk assessments and implementing risk management activities under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. These improvements include the establishment of a vulnerable populations panel to help better understand the real-life exposures of vulnerable populations to chemicals. In parallel with these efforts, Health Canada has also undertaken science and research initiatives targeting the environmental health risks facing Canada's Indigenous populations. For example, Health Canada, in partnership with the Anishinaabe Aski Nation, as well as Indigenous Services Canada and other partners, recently completed the Sioux Lookout Children's Environmental Health Study.
This multi-year study was undertaken to characterize indoor and outdoor air quality in First Nations communities in Canada because of the high levels of respiratory illness such as bronchiolitis and pneumonia in children.
Valuable insights into the linkages between housing, indoor air quality, and health. We now better understand the current state of housing in the Anishinaabe Aski Nation, but we also have a better understanding of air quality related issues. Finally, since 1991, Health Canada, along with other federal departments, has supported the Northern Contaminants Program. The objective of this program is to reduce or eliminate contaminants in traditional foods and to provide information on contaminants and communities so they can better protect themselves. This program includes biomonitoring of contaminant levels in northern populations.
I wish to thank the committee for the opportunity to appear here today and to highlight these examples of Health Canada activities undertaken to better understand and take action to address the environmental health risks. Thank you. What I have here as a speakers list, Mr. Albus, Mr. Saini, Ms. Posey, and Mr. Bachrach. So, Mr. Albus, you have 6 minutes.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. And I certainly want to thank our officials for being here today and the work that you do on behalf of all of our constituents. I'm going to start first with the implication of this bill is that the government isn't doing this work now. So let me ask, when developing policy, do you ignore the, and I quote, link between race, social economic status, and environmental risk?
So, thank you very much for the question. Very, very valid question. Absolutely, when we do work, for example, chemical risk assessments, we do factor in definitely exposure of chemicals that we are assessing to vulnerable populations. And by vulnerable populations, we look at certain populations that could face greater exposure to the types of chemicals that we are looking at. And in many cases, The assessments have resulted in areas where we've identified risk management actions that have to be taken, and that has been, we've then put in regulations or management actions to address those exposures of concerns. And several of them have been, as I mentioned, targeted because of vulnerable populations that have been identified in the risk assessments that we've conducted.
So from Health Canada, you say, yes, we already do this.
We probably do not do it to the extent that's described in this act, but we do certainly factor in vulnerable populations and exposure to vulnerable populations when we do our risk assessments.
Thank you. And I'll go over to Ms. Farkelson on ECCC, I should say ECCC.
Yeah, and I think to the extent that David is talking about a chemicals assessment, that's something that ECC and HC and Health Canada do together. We work together on that program. And I would say as well, sort of on the framework side of things, major policies are developed with through a sort of a lens of gender-based analysis plus, and although the emphasis, like the title of that is gender-based, but the goal of using that analytical tool is to pay particular attention to intersectional analysis of race, Indigenous, disability, sexual identity, among other characteristics.
So a lot of this is already taken into under current law.
It's
okay. Well, that's, yeah. You nodded, so that's all I need to see. I'll go to Ms. ENVI, please. Do you collect information relating to the impact on environmental hazards and assess the enforcement of provincial laws?
So in the role that I play, which is the Director of the Information Indicators Division, I'm primarily responsible for a program called Environmental Sustainability Indicators, which essentially works with data that's generated by other programs. So the department, yes, does collect information on emissions of substances and also on the environmental quality.
What about the enforcement of provincial laws?
Within our indicators, sorry, go ahead, Laura.
Go ahead, okay.
Indicators program, I can speak to what we work with, and predominantly we're looking at federal enforcement at this stage, but I'll ask Laura's comments on the provincial side.
Yeah, I think the
Excusez, Madame Posé, Samé, Samé, vous avez un point.
Ms. Posé has raised her hand. I think that Ms. Neve's connection doesn't allow for interpretation, so I don't know if there's something that we can do to improve that connection. Could our clerk look into whether we have a problem? Because Ms. Neve does have her headset on, but, well, there seems to be a problem with the connection. Or perhaps she could come back another day if we can't fix the technical problem. I can also speak in French if that is helpful. Is it better? So you speak French? So, Madam Clerk, can we hear her better in French? We'll have to get her to speak a little bit more. Would you just speak a little bit more, please? Speaking in French? Yes. I'll answer the question then, if you like. As to whether we have data on environmental emissions and pollution, yes. But in answer to the second part of the question, I'm just looking for my words here. The promotion and enforcement of the legislation. Well, my answer there would be that the program that we work with is not necessarily at the provincial level. So I hope that is helpful.
I think one important point
Just one moment, please. Mr. Albus?
I really want to make sure that this is not all going to go under my time, Mr. Chair, because there was a lot of going back and forth and saying things.
The clock has been stopped, but are you listening when Madame Neve spoke in French? Did you hear in English?
Yes, I did. Thank you.
Okay, good. Okay. So let's keep going.
Yeah. So again, the assessment of enforcement of provincial laws. That's the one point I'd like to have addressed.
Yeah, it's Laura. That is not something that we would generally do, assess the administration and enforcement of environmental laws.
Okay. Yeah, and really it's up to auditor generals in those provinces, I think, quite honestly, but I may be wrong. So my question is then, if the departments, these two departments are already aware of these real problems and are working on them, why do we need to spend 2 years working on a report to tell these officials what they are already doing? Could someone explain that? Is it just the will of Parliament?
Who would like to answer that?
Well, I think I don't think it's our place to comment on the value of the bill.
Fair enough, Mr.
Well,
Albus.
if again, that's
that would have been a good
I'm
question
asking.
for.
Yeah,
that would have been a good question for Ms. Zan, but she's not on this panel. So, but
can I? How many minutes do I have left?
Well, I'll give you a little extra. So why don't you take 45 seconds, including the answer?
Okay. Well, you know what? I'll do another round, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, you're up again, I think. So.
Yeah, and I do appreciate the officials how difficult it is to work from home and to have everything there. So I appreciate them trying to work with all of us.
Okay, Mr. Staney for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and I also want to thank the witnesses for attending today and enlightening us on this very important topic. Challenging circumstances. Mr. Murrah, I would like to start with you if I could, please. Bill C-230 establishes a vulnerable populations panel to help better understand and address the effects of toxic chemicals on vulnerable populations. Will that panel help to address some of the concerns raised in this bill, and do you...
You're cutting out, Mr. Staney.
That is a step towards ending environmental racism in Canada?
Thank you very much for the question, Mr. Saini. I'm not sure I fully understood it. The connection temporarily froze.
Would you like me to repeat it?
Please, yes.
Okay. Bill C-230 establishes a vulnerable populations panel to help better understand and address the effects of toxic chemicals.
You're cutting out again, I think.
Will that panel help to address some of the concerns raised in this bill, and do you see that as a...
Point of order, Mr. Chair?
Yes, Mr. Albus.
Again, I really don't want to interrupt here, but if the member cannot be heard because of technological reasons, maybe we can maybe you can log out and come back. But if not, then perhaps Mr. Saini can take his questions and we can send them to the officials through the clerk and have them on the record.
Mr. Saini, we can't hear you. So
can I propose, Mr. Chair, that we go to the next speaker and then just come back to Mr. Saini as he
okay, let's try that. Yeah,
logs out and logs back in.
Yeah, Mr. Saini, why don't you log out?
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Take another run.
So let me repeat the question again.
Okay. Well, you're out again, I think. I can't hear you.
Okay. Let's try one more time. Can you hear me now?
Sort of, yeah. Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. So Bill C-28 establishes a vulnerable populations panel to help better understand and address the effects of toxic chemicals on vulnerable populations. Will that panel help to address some of the concerns raised in this bill, and do you see that as a step towards ending environmental racism in Canada?
We heard all that. Okay.
So it's Laura. I think I can start, although I know you directed that to David Morin, but just to clarify.
But it's okay.
What's in Bill C-28? It recognizes a right to a healthy environment for every individual as provided under SEPA, and then requires the development of an implementation framework to describe how that right will be, to elaborate on how that right will affect the administration of the Act. There's no requirement to create a vulnerable populations panel, but perhaps it was that implementation framework that you're referring to. At the same time, though, there are a number of specific references to vulnerable populations in the bill. There's probably two ways that the bill addresses the issues underlying, that the Bill C-28 addresses the issue underlying this bill. And the first is in the research requirements amendments would require the Minister of Health to conduct biomonitoring surveys, and it specifically says in the bill that those could be in relation to vulnerable populations. And also there's explicit recognition that the government's duty to exercise its powers must be done in a way that protects the environment and human health, including the health of vulnerable populations. Both ministers must consider available information regarding vulnerable populations and cumulative effects when conducting and interpreting the results of certain risk assessments, and in developing the plan of chemicals management priorities. And maybe I'll stop there. That's probably enough. So those are all ways that I think get at some of the issues that are underlie this bill as well.
So if you'd like me to add to what my colleague Laura just mentioned from a Health Canada perspective, we have over the past many years started including vulnerable populations in the risk assessments that we do. And one of the exercises we did do was establish a vulnerable populations panel. This allowed us to better understand and appreciate the range of vulnerable populations that are out there and how they could each individually be affected by chemical exposure and what their particular uniqueness is. I think really what makes the difference in terms of our true ability to factor in vulnerable populations then resides on the availability of data, and to get a sense of what levels are we seeing in vulnerable populations with regard to particular chemicals, where do they happen to be located with regards to sources of exposure to chemicals. And so it is that combination. Great to have a panel to identify and expand our understanding of vulnerable populations. It is largely driven by the data that's available. And definitely as we go forward, the establishment of panels such as that will help broaden our understanding of the issue as we take into consideration the perspectives and the views of a range of other vulnerable populations. Thank you.
Just to follow up to that, Mr. Moran, we've heard examples where it's clear that racism has played a significant role in where environmental destruction takes place and what is done about it as a result of this bill in order to prevent similar things from happening again.
Who's that for?
So,
Mr. Moran, just a follow, or either or.
So Laura, could you...
Yeah, was the question how does Bill C-28 address the citing of industry? Sorry, it did break up a little bit. Was that the essence of the question?
Okay. Well, what processes do you see changing as a result of this bill in order to prevent similar things from happening again? It's more of a general question.
Yeah, I think that what the amendments do is bring require a specific a lens to decision making under the act, and so in that sense, well, that's just it. It requires you to look at it from the perspective of making sure that people equally enjoy a healthy environment and don't disproportionately bear the burdens, especially for irrelevant reasons like race.
Merci beaucoup. Alors, on passe.
Thank you very much. We will now go to Ms. Posey. You have 6 minutes, Ms. Posey. Thank you. Yeah, I always have to wait for the interpretation. I want to thank all of our witnesses for being there to help us understand. My question is for you, Ms. Farquharson. In Bill C-230, there is a definition section, but there is no actual definition of environmental racism. We are introducing a new concept in this bill, and so it would be a good idea if it were defined. We know that concepts evolve, and we have to make sure that the terms and concepts used are well understood. So what are the implications for you to having to develop policies without having clearly defined concepts and terms?
Okay, so I'll just talk generally about how the need for definitions in legislation. Like clearly, if parliamentarians have a clear idea of what it is they want to get at, particularly, then it should be defined in the legislation. And when there are not definitions in the legislation, then it can be difficult to know how exactly to implement that in the way that parliamentarians intended. Of course, there's lots of sources for trying to find out what the definition should be. At the same time, I can say that as you noted, like on a subject matter like this, where the definition, there is no definition in federal law, and you have to gather it from academics and others who are talking about the subject matter. It also means it's evolving, and so in some senses, you may want some flexibility on a definition so that it can evolve and grow through the consultation that you have. So I guess what I'm saying is that yes, it can be difficult. Okay.
I understand. Please go ahead. Yes, so there is a need for very clear definitions. If in Canada we had legislation that established the right for all citizens to have a high quality environment, as is the case in Quebec under the Charter of our rights and freedoms, then we could take action when people's rights are violated. In your opinion, if we wanted to make sure everybody had the same rights and universal standards were respected, is that not the right approach? I don't know if my opinion is relevant in this case. It's rather a question that is political in nature. I think it's a legal question. Well, that is why I addressed my question to Ms. Farquharson, because she works in legal and regulatory affairs, so I thought she would be the right person. So if we guarantee rights for everyone to have access to a healthy environment, then that would be best. Under the Quebec Charter of Rights and Freedoms, we have a quasi-constitutional document that guarantees this. Well, if I may intervene here, some rights are in charters and but how do we enforce them? That's just my opinion. Well, I agree with you, Mr. Chairman. We need regulations that can be used to enforce the respect for these rights. I don't know if Ms. Farquharson would like to add something. I would say that, generally speaking, almost all of the issues that society deals with require a number of tools to address. Well, Bill C-230 is a tool to try to have these rights respected. Well, I want to come back to Bill C-28 as well. It indicates that there is a right to a healthy environment and to protect vulnerable populations. It's a very relevant question. We have tools under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. I think we will now go to Mr. Bachrach.
Mr. Bachrach.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. I'd like to start out picking up on a theme in your presentation. You talked a fair bit about Ms. Farquharson, about vulnerable populations, and it struck me the contrast between what we were hearing from Dr. Waldron when she talked about disproportionately affected communities. I suppose to me, the phrase vulnerable populations makes it sound like there's an inherent weakness there that makes them especially prone to the impacts. Whereas what I was hearing from Dr. Waldron was more that the siting of these toxic sites, these are intentional policy decisions made by decision makers. I'm wondering if one unique contribution of this private members bill that Ms. Zan has brought forward would be the introduction and proliferation of different language around these communities that are disproportionately affected.
That is a really good point. I think there are, I suppose we're at the beginning of these discussions as a society. So different languages being used to describe different or slightly the same or slightly different things. On the development of that definition of vulnerable population, I might turn to David just to describe where that came from, if that's of interest.
Absolutely. If it's of interest, I could certainly provide elaboration on that. Essentially, what we did do was we embarked on a consultation to get a sense of what exactly vulnerable populations are from a Canadian perspective. We had the work that we do under SEPA and under the Chemicals Management Plan. We established a vulnerable populations panel. We brought forward a range of different representatives that represented different groups of vulnerable populations. We listened to them, we heard them. We also looked internationally to get a sense of what other jurisdictions identified as definitions of vulnerable populations. And we essentially then pulled together a consultation document that went out for discussion in terms of vulnerable populations. And that is ultimately how we landed on the definition that we currently have, or that is proposed with regards to vulnerable populations. And the purpose behind that was, to really get a sense of the different age groups, the different categories of Canadian people who could be vulnerable, and also getting a sense of, from an exposure perspective, what this could mean.
I appreciate the comments. I would argue, however, that certainly from the description we received from Dr. Waldron, they're not vulnerable, they're discriminated against. And I think there's a marked difference between those two concepts. And so I think, in this discussion, it really highlights to me why this bill makes such an important contribution in our understanding of how decisions around the environment impact communities that have been subject to systemic racism over time. So maybe just shifting the focus a little bit, all of our witnesses are public servants, and they look at these bills through a unique lens. Part of that is the practicality of implementing them and having the bill's contents reflect change in the way that the government makes decisions and in the way that government decisions are experienced by Canadians and by the environment. When it comes to the contents of the bill, are there specific areas that you feel could be strengthened to make the bill more easily implemented by your department? And that's to any of the witnesses. I suppose Ms. Farquharson.
Yes, I can address that. So I would say that in reviewing it, a few things struck us. One I think back to your point about vocabulary or terminology, environmental justice is, I think, possibly a term that it's used in the bill, but perhaps that might be something. And I suppose there are other aspects.
I don't know if we're cutting out or.
Maybe,
yes,
maybe
and
I could add on to my question if
the
you'd
flexibility.
like.
Yeah, there's not much time left. Maybe just time for a comment, Mr. Bacharach.
Well, I appreciate the comments we'd received, and perhaps I'll just ask Ms. Farquharson if she'd like to finish her thought, and I'll end with that.
Okay, Ms. Farquharson, anything to add briefly?
Well, I guess I can say in general in bills, it's striking a balance between being specific enough so that you know what you want to do, but being flexible enough so that you don't end up in a situation of box checking or exploring avenues that aren't within the jurisdiction or that that don't have longevity. So you want to make sure that you have something that will last, and those are probably the key points.
Okay, we'll go to a second round. Instead of 5 and 2.5, we'll do 4 and 2. So we'll start with Ms. McLeod, followed by Mr. Biddle.
I think.
Is it yourself, Mr. Albas?
Yes.
Okay,
yes,
go ahead.
Mr.
Go
Chair.
ahead. Go ahead then for 4 minutes. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So 4 minutes, quick as I can. So when people think of rights, they think of the Charter, for example. The government cannot do this to you. Those kinds of civil rights, etc. And there's multiple ones. But yet, the right to a healthy environment. What does that mean, and are they at the same level?
The Bill C-28 recognizes a right to a healthy environment under SEPA, and it's set out that there will be an implementation framework to delineate how that lens will be used in the administration of the Act.
Okay, so will the right to a healthy environment under SEPA then only solely apply to the regulatory enforcement of SEPA?
It will. I mean, not only to regulatory enforcement, like it would apply also to how policies are developed under that Act as well. But the point is, it only applies to that Act.
So it's a limited right, or not even technically that. So because usually rights are something that is, all encompassing. But that's an opinion. So I won't push you any further on that front. So here's a question. Dr. Warden did say that often it is the decision makers that have internal biases and makes it difficult for them to be able to, make recommendations because they don't see the biases. So will this bill require ECCC and to hire consultants so that they have someone that's outside of those biases? Or will this work be done by ECCC?
Yeah, it doesn't require the hiring of consultants. I suppose unconscious bias is something that we all have to work on, and that you address through your own training and awareness, but also through consultation and through meaningful engagement of the people who are going to be affected by whatever it is you're doing.
So here's a question. So we're Canada is part of the Minamata Convention on Mercury. Lots of Asian factories burn mercury to dispose of it. Doesn't happen in Canada, but it does happen, and it floats up into the stratosphere, and it ends up falling on the second largest landmass in the world. And a lot of that ends up getting into Indigenous women and men as well, but at higher levels, women. ECCC did a very extensive study they revealed last year. So if you have something like that happening, will then you then say, this is happening, we need to do recommendations? Aren't you kind of telling yourself that you have to do better in that? And then what happens if, again, Global Affairs is responsible for dealing with the convention. Do you then recommend that they do a better job? How does that work?
Yeah, very briefly, you have 30 seconds, please, Ms. Farr.
Yeah, I would say we're not unfamiliar. Even like I mentioned, the gender-based analysis plus analysis in terms of bringing that kind of a lens to the thinking. But certainly, as you say, it's a whole of government effort sometimes.
So will your department hold other departments accountable, or
we got to move on? But
not under that act.
An interesting question, but I will go to Mr. Biddle for 4 minutes.
I don't want to put her on the spot, but I was hoping to ask Ms. Zahn if she had any questions that she wanted to ask.
Well, she's not on the. I don't know. I mean, this is a bit of a curveball here, Mr. Biddle.
She's a member of Parliament, and she's here.
True. I see what I understand what you're doing. Okay, that's very, very gracious of you. Okay, Ms. Zahn, do you want to take some of Mr. Biddle's time?
Well, thank you very much. That was unexpected, but I do want to. Can you hear me? Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. No, I did want to say that I think we have to be careful here. If to take a look around, everybody that is on screen, including myself, are white. And what Dr. Waldron is saying is that, there are unconscious biases, and that's why this Bill C-230 is so important, because it puts the focus back on the fact that racialized people have been treated differently in the past, and we need to make sure that that stops. And that's why this bill is important. Also, I think we have to be careful not to say things like instead of like Black Lives Matter, all lives matter. This is a specific bill about race and about the fact that some people have been treated as less important than others. And that's why we need to change the way things are done. So I would like to make that point. And I don't think that's something that the bureaucrats can actually answer, but that's my 2 cents worth. Thanks.
Back to you, Mr. Biddle.
Thank you so much. Yesterday, and I know officials from ECCC briefly discussed it, but the government introduced legislation to strengthen the Environmental Protection Act, delivering on an important commitment. I was wondering if you could the committee understand or perhaps explain, I know you got cut off at the end, the linkages between Bill C-230 and Bill C-28, and how Bill C-28 could help address issues identified in Bill C-230.
Sure. So I think if the amendments to SEPA that were introduced in Bill C-28, if they pass, then the Minister of Environment and Climate Change and the Minister of Health will be required to undertake research and studies, and the Minister of Health will be required to undertake research and studies, including biomonitoring surveys, and which could focus on vulnerable populations. So that gathering of data and the requirement to gather that data, as I think your previous witnesses talked about too, is really crucial to understanding what the issues are and being able to come up with solutions that will work. And I think as well, then we have the right to a healthy environment that's been recognized under the Act, and in that an implementation framework will be developed. And I think to the point of how important it is to have people being involved in that, it has to be developed in 2 years, and there will be consultation on that, so that we understand what's important to people in developing what a right to a healthy environment means under SEPA. And as well, I think I mentioned, that implementation framework must address principles of environmental justice, which is obviously, it's a broader term than environmental racism, but I think captures the intersectionality.
Perfect. Yeah.
Okay, I think you want me to stop, Kate.
Yeah. Okay, Madame Posey, 2 minutes.
2 minutes, Ms. Posey. Yes. So what I understand is that If we bring in new policies based on new rights, such as the right to a healthy environment, everyone should benefit from that. If the policy is well thought out, that will resolve the situations that are unfair. So those that suffer the most harm will receive redress and help from the state. That is my understanding. The rights and criteria to benefit from environmental protection are universal. And so if the policies are applied fairly and to everyone, then we will reduce inequalities. According to your experience and expertise, is that not what would happen under this type of new legislation? Because we are providing for a healthy environment for everyone. Who would like to answer? I think that this is pretty much the same question. Yes, it is. I just tried to be a little bit more specific. I think that you are asking me to you're asking me to say whether it would be a good idea to to distinguish with respect to yesterday's legislation. Well, it's kind of a political question. It may be similar to Mr. Bittle's question. Bill C-28, if it is applied and put in place properly, it should reduce discrimination. Well, in principle, yes, but C-28 is a broader bill than this one, than environmental racism, which is the subject of this particular bill. We'll go now to Mr. Bachrach.
For 2 minutes. 2 minutes, Monsieur Bachrach.
You have 2 minutes, Mr. Bachrach.
Thank you very much. Ms. Farquharson, earlier we heard about the concept of Indigenous-led environmental assessment as a way of addressing what we've heard in terms of environmental racism. My question is around the operationalization of that, and whether I know part of the bill that we're debating today deals with the amendment of other acts, and whether an amendment to this bill to require amendments to the Impact Assessment Act would be a way of operationalizing this idea of Indigenous-led environmental assessment.
Yeah, I don't think I can answer that question.
Okay. You have one more 20-second question, maybe, Mr. Bachrach?
Well, part of me wants to ask that question of Ms. Zan if that was something that came up in the drafting of the bill, but that might be a little bit out of order.
Ms. Zan can ask questions, as I understand it, but not answer them. She's not on the panel.
I think that's fine, Mr. Chair. Perhaps if I only have a couple of seconds left, I'll cede my time, and thank you for the opportunity.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Bachrach. That helps us move along. So, Mr. Redekop, 4 minutes.
Sorry. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a quick question. So Health Canada is responsible for First Nations healthcare. I mean, we already identified that Indigenous communities are one of the targets of this legislation. And so I was kind of curious, I guess, to Mr. Moran, can you tell me that, let me back up a sec. So there was this Auditor General's report, which I won't repeat, but obviously it talked about water. And so in that report, they analyzed from 2015 until now. And so during that period, my question for you is how many Indigenous Canadians became sick due to the lack of clean drinking water, what types of illnesses they had, and the variances against the population in areas where the provinces and municipalities have jurisdiction. Were there studies that your department has done on that?
Very good question. Unfortunately, those are questions that would probably best be answered by Indigenous Services Canada. They are the federal department who are responsible for healthcare for Indigenous populations.
Okay, so maybe another question then with maybe from Ms. Farquharson is, there was discussion about the location of facilities near that. We've been talking about facilities that can cause some trouble, whether they're factories or dumps, but we talked about the concept of environmental risk, or, I suppose you could use more difficult words than that, but areas where there's going to be some environmental challenges. Have there been any studies done by the department to determine if there are Indigenous communities that have these factories or environmental risk co-located near them? Have there been studies on that?
Oh gosh, I think I'm not in a position to answer definitively about that, but I don't know. I do want to clarify through this, like the citing of a number of industries, obviously that's in provincial jurisdiction, right? Some of them are very much in provincial jurisdiction. But I can't answer the question.
Okay, well then let me try a different one then. Are there, when it comes to environmental cleanup projects, does your department track any of those, and are some of those near First Nations reserves?
Yeah, again, I'm not it could be, but I'm not the person to answer that question. And I don't know whether anybody else from ECCC who's on this would know the answer definitively.
Hi, it's Pascal Roberge here. So I'm responsible for the National Pollutant Release Inventory, and we are tracking pollutant releases, disposal, and transfers for treatment and recycling. So our data helps to inform decisions on protecting the environment by allowing really communities to track pollutants in their communities. So we have pollutant releases identified up to the postal code. So depending of the communities, it's possible to use the NPRI, it's the acronym that we use for our inventory, to identify and act on environmental priorities and potentially to study impacts on pollution on our ecosystem and the human health.
I would imagine, go ahead, Mr. Rodick.
Is it possible to provide that information to the committee?
Yes, it's public information, all data since 1993. So it's on open data. So it's possible to consult it on the government website.
I imagine when you're talking about abandoned sites and brownfields that would fall under federal jurisdiction, that information might help you decide where we should be cleaning up first, I guess. But anyway, Mr. Baker for 4 minutes.
Thanks very much, Chair, and I'm going to cede my time to Ms. Zahn.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. Listen, Bill C-230 obviously deals with collecting data from across the nation. And so my question for the departments would be, when it comes to racialized communities and their closeness to various different pollutants, I don't think that this has been information that has been focused upon in the past, has it? Could anybody answer that, please?
I could take a stab if that works. And certainly, I think you raise a very good question. When we do the work that we do to assess chemicals, to set drinking water quality standards, to set air quality standards, it is data that drives all of this. And certainly, when we do our work, as I mentioned before, on vulnerable populations, and we factor in vulnerable populations when we do chemical risk assessments, we need the data. We need the data both in terms of who are those vulnerable populations, and how are they located vis-a-vis these sources of exposure to whatever it is of concern, be it chemicals or end of pipe emissions or smokestacks. So I suspect that the same sort of approach certainly applies to racialized communities, and it is the need to have the data. That is what will drive the work that we do. Thank you.
Thank you. And I know that here in Nova Scotia, for instance, standards have changed over the years, and that's how we progress as a society. And I do know that when the pulp mill was first placed in Boat Harbor and Pictou Landing First Nations, the government was asked on the day whether or not this would affect anybody if this was placed there, and the response was that only a few Indians would be affected. So obviously this is a perfect example of environmental racism, and one would hope that we don't continue down that path. So do you think that this bill will help to put a focus on the fact that racialized people have not been necessarily counted as being important in the past, and that going forward we need to be able to change that and make sure that these kinds of issues are addressed and that we don't continue to do so? Do you think that this bill could help us to collect the data and the information so that we make sure we don't do this in the future?
I think the short answer is yes. It will certainly raise attention and awareness. Related to that, you have in the bill beside you, you talk about information collection, you talk about statistics, you talk about environmental risk, and certainly these are, some of those data points that I just mentioned before. So I'm putting your bill aside, but I'm looking at the concepts in your bill. And I'm drawing parallels with the work that we've done on chemical risk assessment under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act with regards to vulnerable populations. And truly it is awareness, as you pointed out. We're all white people on this Zoom meeting. And so certainly when we were talking about vulnerable populations, I don't consider myself a vulnerable population and may very well have blinders. So it was important to establish a panel to get a sense of what other vulnerable populations there are. That understanding, I am certain, will evolve over time as we get more information, more data, greater awareness, and then we need the data to be able to do something. So like I said, I'm not necessarily commenting on the bill. I'm commenting on the elements that I read on the paper.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, this has been a very interesting discussion. Thank you to the panelists and to the members for their very good questions that brought out some insights. Thank you to our witnesses. Witnesses are free to disconnect from the Zoom. I just had a couple of items of future business that I wanted to mention. There's no meeting on Monday because of the budget. Our next two meetings will be to continue the plastics study, so that's April 21st and 26th. We're looking for witness suggestions for this bill C-230 by the 26th of April. And the minister, I've been advised that the minister is available on May 12th to speak to the main estimates. So if there's no objection, I will invite him to come on May 12th.
Just on that point, Mr. Chair.
Yeah.
We also do expect the deputy to be there.
Yeah. No, that's understood.
For her duties as an accounting officer, at least for the second hour.
Totally.
And if I could also just make another suggestion, it would be nice if we limited it to 5 heads under the minister. If you have 40 people there, it gets to be just a long process as they figure out who is going to answer which question. So reasonably 5. If the government can make a reasonable argument of why it should be 6, they can bring it to the committee to your attention.
So just for the benefit of the Madam Clerk, we'll aim for 5. The deputy, I guess, and 4 ADMs or whatever. So thank you for a good meeting, and congratulations again, Ms. Zan, if you're still on the call, for the success of your bill at second reading. Everyone, have a great evening, and we'll see you on the 21st.
Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate it.
you.